I welcome today Anselm Franke to our Anthropocene talks in the HKW. Anselm Franke is the chief curator at the HKW. He has curated the Manifesta, he has recently curated the Taipei Biennale, and he is since the beginning of this year part of our team. So when we developed the project of the Anthropocene, Franke was part already of the team. Welcome, Anselm. When we started this discussion, how we approach the Anthropocene project, the Anthropocene thesis, you suggested on the one side also to take a historical perspective and in doing so, in argumenting for a historical perspective, you choose the California situation of the 60s and the 70s as a kind of reference point for the discourse you wanted to bring into the Anthropocene frame. Perhaps with a few words, what is the Anthropocene? The Anthropocene thesis is a thesis by geologists at the moment and is being researched on by a group of people in the context of the Royal Society in London. And basically the thesis is that human beings changed the Earth by their doing to such an extent that the original relationship between nature and culture to some extent dissolved, that already the surface of the Earth is man-made. So this is the project we are working on, and perhaps you explain why you choose this perspective and the role of history too.
Somehow the prominence of history is already something that comes from the geologists as well. No? I remember that the first big geological annual congress that dealt with this theme of the Anthropocene, I think it was 2009, the American Association of Geology, was titled, this annual gathering was titled something with the Anthropocene, and then the subtitle, "The Past Holds the Key to the Future." But this aside, the Anthropocene thesis holds or tends towards describing figures of shift, no? like as you said with the previously mostly dominant notion of nature-culture division. It describes a shift. It describes also a shift in scale. It's the whole Earth that is concerned. It's not that nature is indefinitely bigger.
And it describes also a shift in the notion of history, taking into account not just cultural history, but natural history too, and how human beings inscribe by their doings in natural history.
Exactly, and this, or even one could start thinking on strange changing of places between natural history and cultural history, you know? And then there's this kind of word itself, Anthropocene, which puts the human back into the center. Back, I mean, at least in relation to some discourses that were prominent since a couple of decades on the end of man, the end of humanism, the end of a particular kind of man. And I think somehow this particular kind of human whose end is announced in post-humanism is right the same, that is announced now to be a geological force. But it's not quite clear, is that still the subject of history? Although, of course, that is the call, no? Like, the idea is at least facing global environmental changes. Climate change is, of course, the key reference. Can we act upon it? Can that anthropos actually act upon it. And
but
that was a little bit the question,
yes.
to give this a
May I add
historical.
this? I think to some extent, since the geologists, of course, are reflecting on a development which has taken place already. So, to some extent, one could argue human beings started a development which had these effects on the earth with all the implications, climate change and so on, because all these are now indicators for this new age. And the issue is to initiate a new kind of reflection. What is the role of human beings in this? So there may be not even such a difference to, let's say, relational approaches of human beings in the last 20 years. That the Anthropocene basically is questioning what is the role. Is human beings, are they really designers of the earth? Or do they constantly trigger processes they don't know what is the outcome of?
Yeah, I think also that probably the key question, and it's the question that we want to ask now in the Anthropocene Observatory, that project that tries to trace some of the impact that the thesis has at the moment in international organizations and discourse on climate change. And really the question, combined with this historical perspective, comes down to something like, can we control the earth? And then this is, of course, has already an ambivalent sound, because we know that these control scenarios,
Yes.
at least we find ourselves in a situation where what we are facing is to a large degree unintended.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what would entitle us now to think we could change that and act in a way that where plan and reality would become more synchronous? In a way, the Anthropocene is collateral damage.
Yes.
Historically, I think this question of can we control the earth is an incredibly important question, because it is really almost like the kernel of also the dramatic aspect of modernity. Not only its natural impact, but also its political. And then California really comes in, because in California, a couple of very specific ideas on how to approach the issue of control came about, and also a particular kind of idea of changing one's relationship to nature. The stunning thing is that it seems like, even though they didn't use the word, California, let's say 1971, has had already all the ingredients that we have today in Anthropocene discourse.
But interesting enough, all this started with a countercultural movement, which was in the 60s really targeted against control. It was against the military in the United States, against this whole military complex, against big business. So how did this transition take place from a movement which was really undermining the control systems at these days to a situation where their strategies were used to control?
That is a long journey. I mean, Stuart Brandt, the editor of the Whole Earth Catalog, which is our guiding publication for this Whole Earth California and the Disappearance of the Outside exhibition, he is today advertising or proposing what one could probably call this kind of large-scale control scenarios. Geoengineering is perfect anthropocenic example where you need to have a lot of trust in the ability to control. But let me go back to where this comes from. I think I would not say that it starts with the counterculture. The shift that you described, one can only understand if you go back to the resources that the counterculture used, and that is cybernetics. And this has to do with a much larger vision of trying to find different principles of control. Something one could probably, the tendency would be probably could be called like immanent control, a control that is not imposed, hierarchical, disciplinary, based on the belief in calculating linear causalities, but is based on calculating systemic causalities, circular causalities. And this is what I think one of the key motives of cybernetics as they emerge, kind of both against the technological backdrop, military technological backdrop. We have to learn to predict dynamic processes, not only static linear. But then became a much bigger project, namely the question of how do we exert a certain amount of control in societies of mass democracy that avoids a disaster such as National Socialism, but also Bolshevism or Soviet model socialism.
Let's go more concrete into the exhibition. One major aspect of the exhibition is that it works on images, on icons, and there is an interesting kind of ambiguity, because on the one side these icons are based, developed, constructed by technological advancements, and on the other side they are used by social movements exactly against the same advancements they are coming from. So perhaps you can go into the role of these icons.
Yes, I mean the situation you describe is perfectly the situation that occurred with the images of Earth as seen from space. They were the product of a demonstration, a symbolic power demonstration in the Cold War, in the space race of the Cold War confrontation. They were hence the genuine product of what was then called, or is still called, the military-industrial complex. But immediately when these images were seen, they were put to a different purpose. They seemed to have a message that was speaking against that logic that of military confrontation, of the big technocracy, as the counterculture would call it. And it was both in the blue marble, is the famous 72 image, the Earthrise, the 68 image. These two are basically the main icons that emerge in the late 60s, early 70s, where the gaze changes, no? Where the camera turns 180 degrees, and the message seems to be that we have to understand that we have to begin to understand ourselves as planetary subjects, as understanding what it means to be part of this fragile whole, which in Californian terms, both through cybernetics, psychedelia, and Asian spiritualities, that was understood as a whole system.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the images, for us it was important to position images within what you could call an epochal dream, which is not necessarily only a dream, but it certainly is a little bit like a dream condition. It marks a certain horizon, a direction, and this kind of the direction that is articulated here just has its strongest or its most effectful articulation in California, but it's not limited to California.
Yeah, but there is one other aspect which is directly related to California, that is the idea of the frontier. Basically, this American idea of going west, 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 and you reach the beach, and there is no other possibility of going further west, and then the perspective turns around, and the space gets a new frontier. That is one part of the narrative you are telling in the exhibition. Can we come back to this point where this frontier of the space gets conquered, and you have this moment of looking back on yourself as part of this wholeness? What did that mean for in the historical terms?
It meant, if you allow me a slightly tendentious answer, it would say it means the end of Cartesianism, or that's what it wants to mean. Mm-hmm. It means the image wants to say, or seems to say, from the outside that there is no more outside. Mm-hmm. That's why it's also easy to forget that it's taken from the outside, mm-hmm. and to forget the kind of technology and its history that has brought this image into being. It seems to have a different message, mm-hmm. no? One of systemic implication, of immanentization, or as Nixon would put it already in 72, so the militant phase where this was like on the side of a counter movement was in fact pretty short. In 72, Nixon would already say, it's time that we make peace with nature. So it calls for peace with nature, and that of course means the end to a certain modern subject that looked from the outside of the world with its instrumental reason, mm-hmm. and attempted to shape it according to its designs. The interesting thing is that this kind of oneness seems not quite easy to realize, or let's say it articulates itself in a very particular kind of politics. It seems that we speak of a planetary subject, like in the same way that this image is for everybody. Yeah. It shows the condition of us all. And our attempt with this exhibition was to show that the kind of solutions of what that means that have followed this call, mm-hmm. are very particular and are in fact continuities of a frontier thinking. Mm-hmm. This is what leads us to the Silicon Valley. Yeah. That's what leads us to network capitalism, yeah. And not a break with this, yeah. frontier.
Would you say that this kind of new experiencing of wholeness has as a consequence that there is no possibility of an outside point of view, and thereby also undermining completely political strategies?
This is a difficult question.
Would you argue also in a kind of wholeness setup, political strategies are possible?
It is all the question of what that exactly means. It's wholeness is always a unification. Wholeness is always and then the question is under what contract, no?
And who defines?
Who draws the line?
Yeah, who draws the line?
And how could you negotiate that line? What falls out of its sides,
yes.
etc. This is the kind of political
question. At the moment you negotiate the line, you are already outside.
I would say in most cases that's probably true, yes. Because the line, in fact, always becomes somehow something normative as well. And the fact that the image of Earth did not unify humanity, mm-hmm. and did not pacify humanity's relationship with the planet, mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think is quite obvious for everybody. So in this, coming back to the icon, it's the kind of trying to extrapolate that as a very powerful dream once, and then it became the only ecological or the only political vision that was ever put into practice of what ecology means. And that political practice is, as a model, is basically the Silicon Valley model of an integrated idea of biological, human and technological systems called Vivi Systems, by one of the Silicon Valley protagonists, animated, self-regulated ecologically by capitalism. And from this dream we are still about to wake up. We don't know quite yet in what world do we wake up. But the interesting thing is how market, technology, and ecology got absolutely intertwined in California. And that's why this particular history is so important. And also because today we could think that the Anthropocene is a moment where now we need to act all together. But the fact that the ecology discourses that we are having politically mean actually that to agree and to act becomes ever more complicated, because the sides of conflict multiply. It is even not possible to agree on data anymore so easily. So the crisis is, I think, very much also on the level of building political consensus, and for that you also need historical perspectives.
I mean, when one looks on contemporary discussions at the moment, one gets the feeling that we are living in a kind of transformation process where the classical criteria to judge what is happening are lost. They are not anymore functional. If one looks at the way you narrate a story in the exhibition, let's say from the 60s up to beginning of the century, then one has the impression there is a kind of linear kind of development from the utopian to the dystopian, and it seems to be almost kind of Hegelian perspective of what is happening there, which to some extent is counter narrative to the experience I just described before. How would you?
Well, I think on the one hand that to tell more or less linear narratives is absolutely crucial, as long as one knows that they have their shortcomings. Why is it crucial? Because the narrative itself becomes the negotiation side of historical morphologies, no? How one thing morphs into the other, and that is exactly, or morphing is maybe a little bit too tendentious. What, let's say, narratives help us to understand the differential between ideas and their outcomes. And this is, I think, still the biggest theme of modernity / the Anthropocene. What happens to ideas on the way from the brain, to speak in this kind of old language, to the world. And that is really what this, it's not really a linear narrative, but a set of transitions that is actually Hegelian, but certainly the other way around. Like, it's dialectical because it tries to look at how one thing can turn into its opposite.
It seems that you take an outside perspective and describe, let's say, from a Californian perspective, of course, the last 50, 60 years with a clear-cut narrative.
Yes, because it's the part of the rehearsal to try to do that in order to understand. I think that the important thing is to insist ecologically that there is no more outside, and that this means that above all the still existing export methods in all kind of outsides that capitalism still produces are becoming increasingly tying the knot around us. So on the level of ecology, I think one has to demand the real end of the outside. On the level of politics and thought, I think there's always an outside possible, even impossible not to have an outside. And this implication thing becomes a method of adaptation. Now, just to give a brief turn on it, the exhibition tries to almost with an extra effort to historicize something, as if it's like something that can be put in a historical museum, which is still far too close to us, which we actually don't have the distance from, because we live in it, and it tries to push us a little bit artificially, with an extra effort, not artificially maybe, but like to produce this distance in order to in order to be able to question this historical dream of which I spoke, like the historical dream that cybernetics and ecology and the idea of imminent self-regulation was.
Last question. We started to speak about the concept of the exhibition, and you have an art background. You are an art curator, and when you go into this exhibition, what the first impression is that you are moving in a kind of book translated into space, which has different windows. On the one side, art objects. On the other side, for example, music videos. So you can enter in this book, which is translated into space, into different other worlds. How would you describe this conceptual approach from in relation to the developments of the arts and as a curator to realize such an exhibition?
There is a not so explicit parallel art narrative. Like these, I guess one could call them small ideology critique grant narratives, which has to do with that at a similar moment, it's what Jeff Wall describes as the conceptual reduction, sort of art, the Western modern art history went through this eye of the needle of this conceptual reduction and has since begun to follow this paradigm that is called the expansion of the field, no? Like the unbounding of the borders of art. And this exhibition could be understood as an implicit questioning of this paradigm of the unbounding. Else, the art has a very...
In that sense, it's also related to the process it describes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Sorry.
Else, you have works there that are completely cutting, like vectorially cutting through the narrative and make it destabilize it. And other works are more like symptoms, show the intensity of a particular dream condition. As when you see the LSD paintings of Adrian Piper, who later did not exactly become known for passionate immersion in dream conditions, but rather in deconstruction. And but then, you know, today she makes mostly Vedic paintings, and these kind of historical parabolas, if you will, are interesting to question, I think. I mean, the idea is that sometimes you could see a work of art in this exhibition as a totally sovereign act of moving a signifier, and sometimes it becomes a symptom, and then in the next moment it could, hopefully in most cases, also be the reverse. But in this kind of format of a quasi-historical essay exhibition, to inscribe art into this cultural dream of an epoch, I think demands that one can take this rather dangerous, because it's not exactly always legitimate to look at art as symptom, no? Yeah. But this kind of analytical perspective that becomes possible here without patronizing it completely, I think makes it interesting in the sense that it questions what is done today against the historical backdrop that is a little bit disturbing.
Thanks a lot.
Pleasure.